I never expected Leland Whitmore to remember my name, let alone invite me to dinner at his restored Victorian in Eureka, California. We'd met exactly once, at a faculty mixer where I'd nervously introduced myself as the new literature professor, and he'd smiled that crooked smile that made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't felt since graduate school. "Thursday at 7, he'd said, pressing a handwritten note into my palm outside the campus coffee shop. "Nothing fancy. Just company." Standing on his wraparound porch that evening, clutching a bottle of wine like a lifeline, I wondered what exactly I was walking into. The house glowed warmly from within, and through the lace curtains, I could see him moving around the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, dark hair falling across his forehead in that way that made me forget how to form coherent sentences. When he opened the door, wearing a simple button-down and jeans that somehow looked elegant on his lean frame, his smile was different, softer, more intimate than the polite professor mask he wore on campus. "Dashiell," he said, and the way my name sounded in his voice made something flutter in my stomach. "I'm so glad you came." The scent of rosemary and something richer, one maybe, or just the warmth of his cologne, drifted out to meet me. I stepped inside, acutely aware of how close we stood in the narrow entryway, how his fingers brushed mine as he took my coat. "Your house is beautiful," I managed, though what I really meant was "you're beautiful," standing there with flowers somehow dusted across your cheekbone and your eyes catching the lamplight like amber. "It's been a labor of love," he said, leading me toward the kitchen. "Much like everything worthwhile, I suppose." The way he looked at me when he said it made my throat tight for reasons that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. Dinner was simple, roasted chicken with herbs from his garden, vegetables that tasted like they'd been pulled from the earth that morning, bread that was still warm from the oven. But the way Leland served it, the careful attention to each detail, made it feel like a feast. "You cooked all this?" I asked, aware of how domestically intimate this felt, sitting across from him at his small dining table while rain began to tap against the windows. "Cooking is meditation for me," he said, refilling my wine glass with careful precision. "There's something about creating something nourishing with your hands that feels honest." I watched his hands as he spoke, long fingers that I'd noticed during his lectures, the way they moved when he was passionate about a point. Now they were cutting his chicken with the same deliberate grace, and I found myself wondering what they would feel like against my skin. "What about you?" he asked. "What makes you feel honest?" The question caught me off guard with its intimacy. "Writing," I said finally. "But only when no one's looking. The stuff I publish is safe. The real writing is just for me." He leaned forward slightly, and I caught that scent again, something warm and woody that made me want to lean closer. "What kind of real writing?" "Poetry, mostly. Nothing groundbreaking. Just feelings I can't say out loud." "Would you share one sometime?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibility. In the soft lamplight, his eyes looked darker, more serious. I realized we'd both stopped eating, our attention focused entirely on each other. "Maybe," I said, my voice rougher than intended. "If you asked the right way." His smile was slow, knowing. "I'll remember that." The rain outside grew heavier, creating a cocoon of intimacy around us. When he reached across the table to brush a crumb from the corner of my mouth, his thumb lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and I felt that touch everywhere. After dinner, Leland led me to his living room, where a fire crackled in an old stone fireplace and books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. He'd made coffee, real coffee, ground fresh, the kind that filled the air with warmth and promise. "This is where I do my real work," he said, settling beside me on the worn leather couch. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell that intoxicating scent that seemed to be purely him. "Your real work." "The book I'll probably never publish. The one about what it means to find connection in a world that seems designed to keep us apart." I turned to look at him fully, noting the vulnerability in his expression. "What's your theory?" "That we're all starving for genuine intimacy, but we're terrified of what it might cost us." His eyes met mine, and the weight of his gaze made my breath catch. What it might change. The fire cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly when he was thinking. I wanted to trace those shadows with my fingertips, wanted to discover what sounds he might make if I pressed my mouth to the hollow of his throat. Change isn't always bad, I said quietly. No, he agreed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sometimes it's necessary. We sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between us and the rain still pattering against the windows. When he reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, the gesture was so tender it made my chest ache. Dashiell, he said, and there was something in the way he said my name, like a question, like a prayer. Yeah. I'm really glad you came tonight. The sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at me like I was something precious and fragile, made my throat tight with emotion I wasn't ready to name. Me too, I whispered, and when he smiled, I felt something inside me shift and settle, like a key turning in a lock. Somewhere around midnight, we'd moved closer together on the couch, the space between us charged with unspoken possibilities. Leland had put on music, something soft and jazzy that seemed to wrap around us like silk, and refilled our wine glasses despite the late hour. Tell me something true, he said suddenly, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the leather cushion between us. What kind of true? The kind you don't usually tell people. The kind that matters. I studied his face in the firelight, noting the serious set of his mouth, the way his eyes stayed fixed on mine. There was something about the darkness outside, the intimacy of the moment, that made honesty feel not just possible but necessary. I think I've been half asleep for years, I said finally. Going through the motions, teaching the same classes, writing the same safe papers. Until tonight, I didn't realize how much I missed feeling awake. His hand moved closer to mine on the cushion, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin without quite touching. What woke you up? You, I said, the word falling out before I could stop it. The way you looked at me at that faculty mixer like you actually saw me. The way you're looking at me now. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Dashiell. Your turn, I said quickly, before he could say whatever was forming behind his careful professor mask. Tell me something true. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I invited you here because I couldn't stop thinking about you. Because every time I saw you on campus, I wanted to know what you were thinking, what made you smile, what you sounded like when you weren't being careful. His fingers found mine at last, intertwining gently. Because I've been alone for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone's company this badly. The admission hung between us, vulnerable and honest in a way that made my heart race. His thumb traced across my knuckles, and that simple touch sent heat spiraling through me. I'm not very good at this, I said. At what? Whatever this is. I tend to overthink things or say the wrong thing or... He leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup my cheek. You're perfect at this, he said softly. You're perfect. When he kissed me, it was soft and questioning at first, giving me space to pull away. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands fisting in his shirt as I kissed him back with all the longing I'd been carrying since that first faculty mixer. Time seemed to slow as we kissed, the rest of the world fading until there was nothing but the warmth of Leland's mouth against mine, the way his hands cradled my face like I was something precious. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. Is this okay? He whispered, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. More than okay, I breathed, amazed by how natural it felt to be this close to him, how right it seemed to have his hands on my skin. He smiled, that soft, intimate smile I was beginning to crave, and kissed me again, deeper this time. His hands moved to my shoulders, then down my arms, leaving trails of heat in their wake. When his fingers found the hem of my sweater, he paused, looking at me with a question in his eyes. I answered by pulling the sweater over my head, watching as his gaze traveled across my skin with something like reverence. His hands followed the path his eyes had taken, exploring the planes of my chest, the curve of my shoulders, with a tenderness that made me shiver. Beautiful, he murmured, pressing a kiss to my collarbone that made me gasp. My hands found the buttons of his shirt, working them open with fingers that trembled slightly. When I pushed the fabric off his shoulders, he caught my hands in his, bringing them to his lips to press soft kisses to my palms. "We don't have to," he started. "I want to," I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. "I want this. I want you." The fire had burned low, casting us in warm shadows as we explored each other with gentle hands and whispered endearments. Every touch was deliberate, cherished, as if we were memorizing each other through our fingertips. When he pulled me closer, skin against skin, I felt that sense of rightness again, like I'd been missing some essential part of myself and had finally found it in the circle of his arms. I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the scent of coffee drifting from somewhere below. For a moment, I was disoriented until the events of the night before came rushing back. Dinner, conversation, the way Leland had looked at me like I hung the moon, the exquisite tenderness of falling asleep in his arms. I was alone in his bed, wrapped in sheets that smelled like him, wearing only my boxers and the t-shirt he'd given me when the fire died down. Through the window, I could see his garden, morning light catching on the last autumn flowers. "Good morning." His voice came from the doorway, and I turned to see him leaning against the frame, fully dressed, holding 2 mugs of coffee. His hair was still mussed from sleep, and there was something domestic and perfect about the moment that made my chest tight with emotion. "Morning," I said, suddenly self-conscious. In the harsh light of day, I wondered if he was regretting what had happened between us, if the intimacy we'd shared would feel different outside the cocoon of firelight and wine. But when he sat on the edge of the bed and handed me a mug, his smile was the same soft, genuine one from the night before. "How did you sleep?" he asked, his free hand finding mine under the covers. "Better than I have in months," I admitted, and it was true. Something about being close to him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, had quieted all the restless energy I usually carried. "I kept waking up to make sure you were really here," he said, his thumb tracing circles on my wrist. "I was afraid I'd dreamed the whole thing." The vulnerability in his admission made me brave. "I don't want this to be just one night," I said, watching his face carefully. His smile widened, and he leaned down to kiss me, soft and coffee-sweet. "Good," he murmured against my lips. "Because I was hoping you'd stay for breakfast. And maybe lunch. And dinner. I have classes on Monday," I said, though the protest was half-hearted. "It's Saturday," he reminded me, settling more comfortably beside me. "We have time." The promise in his voice, the way he said, like it was already a given, made warmth bloom in my chest. I set down my coffee and pulled him closer, marveling at how perfectly he fit against me. By Sunday morning, I'd learned that Leland hummed while he made pancakes, that he read poetry aloud while I dozed against his shoulder, and that he had a scar on his ribs from falling out of a tree when he was 12. He'd learned that I talked in my sleep, that I made terrible coffee but excellent scrambled eggs, and that I'd been in love with him since that first faculty mixer but had been too afraid to do anything about it. We were sitting on his back porch, sharing the newspaper and a pot of coffee, when he reached across the small table to take my hand. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. My stomach dropped. "Okay. I know this happened fast. I know we worked together and that could complicate things. I know there are probably a dozen reasons why we should be practical about this." I braced myself for the "but" that would end whatever this was before it really began. "But I can't bring myself to care about any of those reasons," he continued, his grip on my hand tightening. "I've spent too much of my life being practical, being careful. I don't want to be careful with this. With you." The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to try. Really try. Not just stolen moments or secret meetings, but something real. Something that might last." I stood up, pulling him with me, needing to be closer. When I kissed him, I tried to pour all my relief and hope and growing love into it, tried to tell him without words that I wanted the same thing. "The department is going to have opinions," I said when we broke apart. "Let them," he said fiercely. "I'm tired of living my life for other people's comfort." The determination in his voice, the way he was looking at me like I was worth fighting for, made me fall a little deeper. Maybe this was what people meant when they talked about finding your person. Not just someone you could love, but someone who made you brave enough to love openly. I love you, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. His smile was radiant. I love you too, he said, pulling me close. God Dashiell, I love you too. 3 months later, I was grading papers in Leland's living room, our living room now, when he came home from his evening seminar carrying takeout from our favorite Thai place and wearing the smile that still made my heart skip. How was class? I asked, making space for him on the couch. Good. Dr. Morrison asked about you again. I think she's starting to suspect. Because you light up like a Christmas tree every time someone mentions my name? Because I can't stop talking about you, he corrected, settling beside me and pressing a kiss to my temple. I'm not exactly subtle. It was true. In the months since that first dinner, we'd both become terrible at hiding how we felt. Leland would find excuses to walk past my office. I'd linger after faculty meetings just to catch a few more minutes with him, and we'd both started smiling at inappropriate moments during department meetings. We should probably tell them soon, I said, leaning into his warmth. Are you ready for that? I thought about it, about what it would mean to go public with this thing between us that had grown from attraction to affection to something so deep and sure it scared me sometimes. About the gossip and the raised eyebrows and the questions about propriety and professional ethics. Then I looked at Leland, at the way he was watching me with patient love in his eyes, ready to support whatever decision I made, and the answer was easy. Yeah, I said. I'm ready. He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Outside, it was starting to rain again, just like that first night when everything changed. But inside, wrapped in his arms with our dinner getting cold on the coffee table and my papers scattered around us like evidence of a life we were building together, everything felt perfect. I love you, he murmured against my lips. I love you too, I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Later, as we cleaned up dinner and got ready for bed, moving around each other with the easy intimacy of two people learning to share a life, I thought about that first invitation, the way he'd pressed that note into my hand like he was passing along a secret. Nothing fancy. Just company. He'd gotten so much more than company, and so had I. We'd found something rare and precious and worth fighting for, the kind of love that made you brave, that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary, that made you grateful for every day you got to wake up beside the person who saw you completely and loved you anyway. As we settled into bed together, Leland's arms around me and his breath warm against my neck, I realized my throat wasn't sore anymore. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this healthy, this whole, this perfectly, completely myself.